Do all of you think you understood well enough what we were talking about last time in Genesis 46 about the 66 and the 70, those numbers there? Because thinking back over that, I had some questions about it. I was throwing in more details than I meant to, getting the 71, the 72, the 73, more or less trying to confuse you to see if you could stay up with what was being said. But I'll be happy to go back over that and simplify it real quickly if anyone needs me to. Okay, let's just go on back over there then. Genesis 46. I don't even know if I got through explaining everything that I wanted to explain. I could tell that some of it was a little confusing to you. So we'll just quickly go over this 46th chapter of Genesis very quickly, and I'll try to simplify it for you. Now, first of all, we're going to end up with a first number of 70. Really, what they're doing here in this chapter, what we have to do to find out what is being meant by what he is saying here, is end up with the figure 70 twice, but do it two different ways. I'm trying to explain this in another way from what I did last time, and I think I can get it down to 3 quick steps for you. So we have to end up with the figure 70 twice, but we have to do it two different ways. And then from these two different ways, we need to end up with the number 66. Now, the first 70 just counts up everyone that he has in the chapter, just as the names are mentioned and then totaled up, remember, in the 33, the 16, the 14, and the 7. And that leaves out Jacob and Dinah. So this is the first 70. You've just totaled up those 4 numbers that he's got at the end of the various sections concerning the different wives of Jacob, and his 2 concubines also, or handmaids that belong to his wives. And so in getting to our first number 70, then we leave out Jacob and Dinah. Now, because Dinah is included in verse 15, and because of verse 8, which says, "These are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt, Jacob and his sons." And we know from this verse that Jacob will somehow need to be included in here. Then when we count up to our 70 the second time, we drop and Onan and add Jacob and Dinah. And we're back to our 70 again. You drop and Onan and add Jacob and Dinah. And then the 66, of course, I think I explained it last time as a dropping of and Onan, but it's already been done ahead of time. So this final 66, you could come up with a 66 earlier, but the final 66 is simply dropping Jacob, Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. And there you've got your 66. I was really giving you more than I needed to last time. And if you don't understand what I mentioned about the shepherds, then just read the end of Genesis 46 and the beginning of Genesis 47. And see if that doesn't appear a little confusing to you, the way it's all written there. And then you can go back and look in your notes or hear the tape what I said about that. It's really no problem there at all. We just have to take it. I've always done this, or not always, but when I first read this passage, of course many years ago, it looked very confusing because I was trying to make something out of it that wasn't there. It looked like that Joseph is somehow trying to trick Pharaoh into not realizing that his brethren are shepherds, but whenever they go before Pharaoh, they tell it anyway that they are shepherds, but then Pharaoh doesn't get mad at them, so you wonder why was Joseph trying to trick him. Well, he's not trying to. We just take it just like it says. He's just warning them and warning Pharaoh ahead of time that his brethren that have come down from Canaan are shepherds, because he knew Pharaoh wouldn't like this, so he's going to warn him ahead of time. And then all he tells his brethren is, be honest when you go in before Pharaoh and tell him what your occupation is, that you're shepherds, because I've warned him ahead of time. Okay, then we'll put that aside and go over to the book of Exodus, and we'll start over in Exodus here this evening. Now, Exodus, of course, the next book coming right after Genesis. And your memory verse here in Exodus is Exodus 15 And verse 13, thou in thy mercy hast led forth the people which thou hast redeemed. Thou hast guided them in thy strength unto thy holy habitation. Exodus 15:13. It's a key verse for Exodus because it's what the chapter or what the book is all about. It's what chapter 15 is specifically about, and it's what the whole book of Exodus is about. That is, it's the great book of redemption in the Old Testament. Genesis is the book of beginnings, but Exodus is the book of redemption in the Old Testament, typifying, as we see in chapter 12, the one lamb that would be slain for a household, as a matter of fact, for everyone's household, that we see fulfilled over in Christ's ministry in the New Testament. Now, the very first word of the first sentence here in Exodus should be and rather than now. It can be translated now, and it is on several occasions, and even if we leave it like this, I think it's still obvious to see that when you start a book with now, you must have had something that came before that. And the reason that I'm stressing that is because it shows that Exodus is merely a continuation of Genesis, which points, of course, back to Mosaic authorship. We have what is known, and we'll be covering this in another class, but the first word in the Hebrew is a wall consecutive, which looks like this, that will be important in our class on creation when we go over to the alleged substantiation for the gap theory in the first couple of verses in Genesis chapter 1. And these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Now you see, that just already supposes that you probably know about Genesis, or it wouldn't have started this way. And you have to have something before this, or you wouldn't understand what he's talking about coming into Egypt here. Now he lists these sons, first of all, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. Now those come from Jacob's two wives. And down in verse 4 we have Bilhah and the other handmaid, their sons mentioned here, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. Now this whole book of Exodus here is very necessary, it's very needful, because it connects the narrative scene that we've seen thus far in Genesis with the rest of the Pentateuch, which deals primarily with the Mosaic legislation that he gives to the whole nation of Israel. So we have to know ahead of time something about Genesis, that Jacob has gone down here to sojourn for a while. Now concerning the name of the book, let me get it spelled like that. The Hebrew name of the book is Wa'ela Shemot, which, remember, the Hebrews take the name of their book from either the first word or the first few words in the book. So Wa'ela Shemot, and these are the names. Genesis with Bereshith, in the beginning. Exodus is Wa'ela Shemot, and these are the names. Sometimes you just see this word, Shemot, which simply means the names. These are the names of the children of Israel. But make sure you know what names he's talking about. He's talking about the children of Israel here. So this is what the name of the book was according to the Hebrews, according to the Septuagint version and the Vulgate, Jerome's Vulgate version. We have the name Exodus, which they got from Exodus 19 and verse 1. And the name Exodus has passed on down from the LXX and the Vulgate on down, of course, into our versions, the Authorized Version, and other English versions. And we certainly don't know it by its name Shemot, but we do know it by its name Exodus. And that's because Exodus is the central theme in the book. It's the story of redemption. They are making a great exit out of the world or out of bondage. And if you look over in Exodus 19 and verse 1, this is where the Greek and the Latin versions got their name in the first place, from whom we've gotten our name. A little bit different, but on over into the English, it's basically the same name, Exodus. In the 3rd month, when the children of Israel exited the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. So this is where they've gotten the name for the book, in Exodus 19 and verse 1. Which really is a more adequate name, because if you called a book Shemot, the names, you might think that's 1 Chronicles, because it's got a lot more names in it than Exodus has. But we can't criticize the Hebrews. That was just their particular way they did things, to call it after the very first few words of the book. But this is certainly a better name as far as we're concerned, for the obvious reasons. It's obvious in the book of Exodus that the whole story is about their great exodus, sojourn, out of the land of Egypt, and at least making an advancement toward the promised land. The purpose of the book of Exodus is to show Israel's great deliverance from bondage. And to show the establishment of the national theocratic rule in Israel. To show Israel's great deliverance. And each one of these books is somehow paralleled with New Testament truths. This one is rather obvious. It's our salvation from the world, comparable to their salvation from the hands of the Egyptians and their king Pharaoh. And along with that, not only their deliverance, but to show the establishment of the theocratic rule in Israel, which of course is the rule of God over his people. Now remember that we covered last time, which we'll begin to see in this book even more, that peculiar phrase that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, terminating with Jacob, not going on to mention the name of Joseph or anyone else. And I told you basically that is because with Jacob, God changes his name to Israel, which points ahead to God dealing with the people as a whole and not with individuals anymore. Now, there's no one any more important here in Exodus through Deuteronomy than Moses, and he certainly appears to be very conspicuous throughout these last 4 books of the Pentateuch. But even though he's put in the limelight and elevated up and given a very high position, it is all with respect to how God is dealing with his people Israel, and people like Moses and people like Aaron are simply mediators between God and his people. But it's no longer just God dealing with Abraham, not dealing with anyone else, but only dealing with an individual and then making promises concerning him and concerning his seed. We see those promises fulfilled. He's got seed now. You see, this is one of the promises that God had made to Abraham, that he'd bless him and make him very fruitful, and that he would give him descendants as the stars in the sky for multitude, and the sand that is upon the seashore innumerable. So now that we're seeing at least the beginning of this fulfillment, God no longer needs to deal with these individuals. He's going right on into his nation as a whole, which again, all these things are types and shadows, Hebrews chapter 8 tells us, of better things that were to come. And of course, that better thing was the church that was to come. The theocratic rule in Israel typifying the theocratic rule in each and every local assembly. Now, seeing that the great theme of Exodus is redemption, or to say it another way, their deliverance from the land of Egypt, this is why we have a phrase that we see, well, I think I've counted it more than 70 times through the Old Testament, and that is whenever God on different occasions is making himself known to his people for some particular reason, he starts off by saying, I am the Lord thy God that brought thee out of the land of Egypt. And you see that over 70 times in the rest of the Old Testament, or the rest of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. I am the Lord thy God that brought thee out of the land of Egypt. In other words, God is basing what he requires out of them, all of the allegiance and fidelity that he requires from them, he's basing this upon the fact that they owe their very deliverance and salvation to him. So obviously, he's going to start off by saying, I am the Lord thy God that brought thee out of the land of Egypt, and now since I did that for you, you owe me something in return, and that is, of course, their life, their obedience. The first time we see this is in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. where we have the most important moral law of the Old Testament, and that is the Decalogue, or the 10 words, the 10 commandments, in Exodus 20, verses 1 and 2. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, that brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And then he starts with the next verse, now this is what I require of you, thou shalt have no other gods before me. So this is a very redundant phrase, recurring phrase that we see throughout the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, it's seen over there in Psalm 81 in verse 10, where he says, I am the Lord thy God that brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Open thy mouth wide, and I will fill it. What we just sang, Psalm 81 in verse 10. We only sing the second half of the verse. The first half, the way it's stated there, I am the Lord thy God that brought thee out of the land of Egypt. So God is basing what he requires from the people upon the fact that in chapter 14 and 15 of the book of Exodus, he's wrought a great salvation and a great deliverance for his people. Now a quick outline for Exodus that we could give in so many different ways, but I'll give it in a real simplified form, a threefold outline. Chapters 1 through 14, we have Israel in Egypt. Now, no longer think of Israel as an individual, the man Jacob. Think of him, or think of this word from here on out as a people. And you can tell by the context in which it's used whether or not God's referring to an individual, that being Jacob, or whether he's referring to his people as an entirety, as a whole. Chapters 1 through 14, Israel in Egypt, 15 through 19, Exodus from Egypt, and 20 through 40, events that take place at Mount Sinai. So we've got the first half of the book, the first 19 chapters. They're in Egypt, and finally they're leaving Egypt. And then with Exodus chapter 20, or really beginning in 19, they actually arrive at Mount Sinai. But in chapter 20, God begins to give them the Decalogue. From here on out through the book of Leviticus, all the way up through, I believe, Numbers chapter 10, all this is taking place at the same time. So basically from Exodus 20 through Numbers 10, all the book of Leviticus, a third of the book of Numbers, a half of the book of Exodus, are all taking place there at Mount Sinai. And they arrive there in chapter 19 and verse 1. This great mountain that God had, of course, originally revealed himself in chapters 3 and 4 to Moses and to Aaron in the first place. Now let me give you some general remarks here about the book. First of all, Exodus introduces us to the man Moses, who's the most prominent figure in all the Pentateuch, and, of course, who wrote the Pentateuch. We know that he himself says that he is a type of Christ in Deuteronomy 18 by saying that the Lord thy God will raise up unto you a prophet like unto me, and him will you hear in all that he says, which is quoted by Peter in Acts chapter 3, the last few verses there. So this man, Moses, is no obscure fellow. We're introduced to him in chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. His story goes all the way through Deuteronomy 34, the very end of the Pentateuch, where both he and it terminate. Another thing about the book, it contains some of the greatest retributive demonstrations of God's power that has ever been seen, second only to the Noachian flood. What are these demonstrations of God's retributive power that I'm referring to? Parting of the Red Sea, what's before that? The plague. Never been anything like it before. The plagues. Those 10 great plagues. And all the while, God is saying, I'm going to continue to harden his heart so I can bring one more plague on it. And then I'm going to harden his heart and bring one more plague on it. So all the world will know that Yahweh is God. And then all that terminates, first of all, with the death of the firstborn, and then finally with, in chapter 14, the parting of the Red Sea. But especially the 10 plagues demonstrate God's retributive judgment. Not even the miracles of Christ over in the New Testament come anywhere near to what we see taking place in the book of Exodus, when God can send in locusts that devour the whole land, turn all the water, not only in the Nile River, but it says in every lake and pond and pool where water stood, turned it into blood. And what's the healing of a headache or a healing of a blind eye compared to that? And then finally, with the death of the firstborn. And of course, we get a lot of typology from that, the firstborn, that we have to have someone substitute in there for us as our firstborn so that God doesn't require our life of us. Which we see in several places, such as in Psalm 77, verses 9 through 20. The book of Psalms is very similar in many regards, in many respects, to Stephen's apology in Acts chapter 7, insofar as it's a commentary, and on top of that, an inspired commentary on so much of the Old Testament. As we'll see when we get over to the book of Psalms, to show how it does make comments on earlier occurrences, particularly during the time and reign of King David, that we wouldn't have found back in Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. But that is supplied for us in the book of Psalms. But here a psalm of Asaph, Psalm 77, verses 9 through 20. Hath God forgotten to be gracious? Hath he in anger shut up his tender mercies? And I said, this is my infirmity, but I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. Now he's referring here back to the book of Exodus. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate also of all thy work and talk of all thy doings, like David in Psalm 103, telling himself not to forget the Lord's benefits. Thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary, and who is so great a God as our God? Thou art the God that doest wonders. Thou hast declared thy strength among the people. Thou hast with thine arm redeemed thy people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. There's the redemption, which is the key in Exodus. The waters saw thee, O God, the waters saw thee. They were afraid. The depths also were troubled. Remember in Exodus 14 it says that the angel of the Lord went about in that cloud right in the middle of them. So the waters really did see. The clouds poured out water, the skies sent out a sound. Thine arrows also went abroad. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. Thou leddest thy people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. All of this speaking there back to the book of Exodus. Now we see there in verse 14, thou art God that doest wonders. If you'll hold your hand there, because we'll be back to Psalms and go back over to Exodus chapter 15. And verse 11. Very similar to verses 13 and 14 here in Psalm 77, because he asked the question in Psalm 77 in verse 13, who is so great a God as our God? Well, Moses, who was the first one to sing the song, and Miriam and the ladies picked it up afterwards, said in Exodus 15:11, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like thee, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? The same thing said over in Psalm 77. Psalm 78, verses 7 to 13. And then we want to look at verses 41 through 53. All of these accounts of God's great power in vanquishing all the foes, all the enemies of his people, should encourage any believer's heart. Yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They remembered not his hand, nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy. How he wrought his signs in Egypt, his wonders in the field of Zoan, and had turned their rivers into blood, and their floods that they could not drink. He sent divers sorts of flies among them, which devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. He gave also their increase unto the caterpillar, and their labor unto the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore trees with frost. He gave up their cattle also to the hail, and their flocks to hot thunderbolts. He cast upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble, by sending evil angels among them. He made a way to his anger. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence. He smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham, but made his own people to go forth like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them on safely, so that they feared not, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. All these psalmists that are writing the Psalms are filled with awe and filled with thanksgiving and wonder and appreciation and encouragement in their own heart on just thinking back on what God has done to their forefathers in the olden times, how he's made a way through the Red Sea, and then he made a way in the wilderness for them, made waters and rivers come out of rocks for them to keep them sustained. Psalm 105 verses 24 to 28, or 38, 24 to 38. Psalm 106 verses 7 to 22. And many other places, not only in the Psalms, but elsewhere in the Holy Scriptures. And then a final remark here that I've already made earlier, and that is, for the first time we see God dealing with his people as a nation. Now let's go back over to Exodus 1. We want to just take the first 2 chapters this evening and look at Moses' early life, which really is the first 80 years of his life. You might not consider that his early life, but that was only his early life. The first 2 chapters of Exodus, Moses' early life, the first 80 years here of Moses' life. Now you'll need to get out your chart here. We'll be using this a lot tonight, the Old Testament patriarchs and judges. Does anyone happen to have an older edition from what I've got up here? Look on yours and see what edition it is. Anyone have a 4 or something below that? Someone's bound to have an older edition. I think this is a little bit different. The one that I keep in my study at home is different than these. And I was looking at this one I keep down here at the church, and it's got a couple of things a little bit different from what I can remember anyway. No one has. I've got a 5th edition of this chart. Yours is a 3rd? Well, let me see yours then. No, yours is a 5th. Really? Well, it's a 5th, though. Look on your chart here. That's a 5th right there. I thought we had some older ones, because I know I have some older ones at home. Patriarchs and Judges? No one? Okay, that's 4th one of Patriarchs and Judges. Let me see that for a moment then. I want to see if anything's different. Yeah, you've got a different one. Okay, that's fine then. Yeah, that's the one I have in my study. It's a little bit older. This one has the 3 icons on it, the 3 pictures on it. The other ones, the older ones, don't have the pictures on it. So I had to scratch these off anyway. My one at home doesn't have the pictures on it. Okay, we'll be coming back to this. So Exodus chapter 1 here. And these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. For Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Now that shouldn't be, come on. That's a little bit too English. Just come. Come, let us deal wisely with them. Lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters, to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom, and Raamses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not, as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. So this is really the first chapter and the introductory chapter of Exodus, because it tells us something that we didn't have any idea of, at least in the end of the book of Genesis, and that is these people who have gone down there, when they went down there, they dwelled in the land of Goshen, which Pharaoh personally gave them as being the best land in Egypt. Now what's happened? All the people are slaves all of a sudden. Now, although we couldn't have known that from the end of Genesis, I want to show you how we could have known that from the beginning of Genesis. If you'll go back over to some of these times where God communicated future events to Abraham, such as in Genesis 15, beginning with verse 13, then we have a clear prophetic indication that what took place in Exodus chapter 1 had already been foreordained of God, and any pious Israelites would have known that this was going to come about. As a matter of fact, remember that both Jacob and his son Joseph both gave a charge unto the Israelites that whenever they left the land, to be sure to carry their bones with them unto the promised land. Now, how did they know they were ever going to leave the land? Must have meant they were going to stay there for a while. And they must have known that. Now, how much they knew, we don't know. But if what was given to Abraham in Genesis 15 was passed down, then they could have known quite a lot. As a matter of fact, they could have known all about the 10 plagues. They could even known about the crossing of the Red Sea. Now, they wouldn't have known it would have been 10 plagues. I'm just saying they would have known that an event like that would have certainly been imminent. Verse 13, And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Now this is long in advance, already revealed. They shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. That would have told us about the place and the crossing of the Red Sea. And afterward they shall come out with great substance, which we see God telling Moses in the end of Exodus chapter 3. Where our King James Version says that they borrowed from the Egyptians, and that's not what they did, because they never intended to pay it back, nor did the Egyptians expect them to pay it back. They took it from them. It was their payment for 400 years of slavery. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation, now here during Abraham's time, a generation was 100 years. It changed later, but since he's already said 400 years in verse 13, then we know that each one of these generations in verse 16 would be 100 years. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, which means back to the land of Canaan. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Another interesting passage. Let me see if I can find later on in Genesis where these very things are said. Well, over in chapter 48 and verse 21, Jacob says to Joseph, God will be with you and bring you again unto the land of your fathers. So it's clearly intimated here in this verse, in Genesis 48:21, that Jacob, or Israel, already knew of what was going to take place. And then, of course, we know from the last chapter, verses 22 through 26, Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. That's Genesis 50:22 through 26. Now we know, of course, in the end of chapter 49 and the first half of chapter 50, that Jacob's bones have already been carried back up there to Canaan. But this is what he had told him to do. Once I die, then I want to make sure that my bones are carried hence, which is what happens in the end of Genesis 49 and the first half of Genesis chapter 50. So the one thing that you need to realize then, since we've already been told by God that they would serve them for 400 years, and we know that they certainly weren't down there very long whenever Jacob went down there. Let's see, how old was he when he got down there? That's over in chapter 47. Let's see, in verse 9, he was 130 years old. We see him in verse 28 of the same chapter as being 147. He's only been down there 17 years. That's not anywhere near 400 years. So it's rather obvious we've got some type of tremendous time span or time gap between the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus, and that is indeed what we have, 300 years between the last verse in the book of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. We have a time period of 300 years, during which time we have a lot of internal disruption and disintegration within Egypt, which in the long run indirectly brings about the subjection of the Israelites into terrible slavery that we see here in the beginning of the book of Exodus. Now the Egyptians are, of course, an ancient people that we have seen all the way back in Genesis 10. In verse 6, by another name here, but remember, most of these personal names in the table of nations refer to just that, nations, because that's why it's called the table of nations. And in Genesis 10 and verse 6, the second-born son of Ham is Mizraim. And that's what the ancient Hebrews knew Egypt by that name, Mizraim. So here we have the very beginning of Egypt all the way back in Genesis 10 and verse 6 under Ham's second-born son, Mizraim. We know that they've become a very advanced power by chapter 12 because they already have the pharaohs there. And chapter 12 of Genesis is when Abraham has gone down on account of the famine. Now I want to show you just briefly here. I didn't try to make it fancy on purpose just so you could see it with the different colors, but you will need to get this down, and we'll be looking at some of this on our map. Show you a little bit of the history of Israel, the different periods through which their culture went, ruled by a series of various dynasties. Now, it's something here in this country that we're not familiar with, dynasties. But there were dynasties in Egypt, there were dynasties in China, all the way into this century. The Manchu dynasty lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Ming dynasty lasted for hundreds of years. Japan, you've got dynasties. Even in Israel, you've got dynasties like the dynasty of David. A dynasty is when it passes from the father on down to the son. It stays in the same family. Then you've got these dynasties. Now, in this country, just because you're president doesn't mean that your son gets to become president. But that's not the way it was in days bygone. The first period is known as the proto-dynastic period. The dynasties, the first two dynasties, lasting from around 3100 to 2700 BC. During this period, we have a consolidation of Upper and Lower Egypt, which is the most important thing that happens during the proto-dynastic period. Upper and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt was comprised of the delta of the Nile River. And Upper Egypt was back beyond the cataract, which is way back past Memphis, further south, in other words. You can look on a map and see where Upper and Lower Egypt. Second period is the Old Kingdom period, dynasties 3 through 6, 2700 through 2200 BC. And this is when we have the great building projects known as the pyramids begun. 2700 through 2200. Now with this third one, you see we're coming into biblical history with the man Abraham, because he's living during this time. We have the first intermediate period, dynasties 7 through 11, 2200 through 2000 BC. Now on your chart, all your chart shows is it's got the 10th and the 11th dynasty there. But basically it starts with the Middle Kingdom, which is the 12th dynasty, which we'll be looking at. The Middle Kingdom, composed of the 12th, I need to go up higher. The 12th dynasty, 2000 to 1800 BC. This is important because this is when Israel, and his sons come down to Egypt. So we have the proto-dynastic, the Old Kingdom period, the first intermediate period, and the Middle Kingdom. You through with that? Then we go on to the second intermediate period, dynasties 13 through 17. 1800 to 1570 BC. And these are the dark years of Egypt. Tremendous national and political upheaval and disintegration. Within the kingdom, it's during, of course, the invasion of the Hyksos. We'll look at more of this on your map. I just want to give this to you as an outline. You can compare this against the biblical history. Then, of course, we come down to the New Kingdom, dynasties 18 through 20, 1570 through 1100 BC, and this is when the Exodus takes place, during the New Kingdom period in Egypt. Now, after this, we have two post-empire periods, but they're only of minor importance, because by this time, Egypt is not the great power that it used to be. Back during the days of Abraham and during the days of Moses, we have the new Assyrian and Babylonian kingdoms arising during the 8th, 7th, 6th centuries BC, and so the final kingdom period here in Egypt terminates in the middle of the 6th century BC. Egypt passes off the scene from there. Never has been important since then either. So characteristic of history that although a kingdom or a country may last what would seem to those contemporary with the rise of that kingdom or contemporary with its greatness indefinitely, it always comes to an end sooner or later. You can't really comprehend that when you're living here. You think of the United States would never fall. It would never come to an end and just be rubble and nothing. But every kingdom that ever has existed has, without exception, always ended. And just because we're living in the midst of things today, you'd think it could never come to an end. And these, of course, the great empires here in Egypt lasted for thousands of years. But they still finally came to an end due to a number of reasons. And every power that ever has been or that ever will be will come to an end. Except the kingdom of God, which is the only kingdom that'll last forever. Now let's go over here to your map, or your chart here, so I can show you several things on this. Because you see what we're getting at here now, when we open up Exodus chapter 1, it's just totally different than Genesis. And I've said already that we have a 300-year time period in between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. But all of this in the first chapter of Exodus will really be obscure to you and of no value whatsoever unless you understand what's going on in Egypt and why Israel or the Israelites are in the predicament which they are. Now, all across the top of your map here, I'm not going to try to hold it up here, just follow with my descriptions. All across the top, you see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We've already covered all this in the book of Genesis. Over to the very right-hand side, well, first of all, you see where the middle kingdom is? It's under Isaac. Really, you've got, 4 sections here. Between each one of these black lines is a section. So if I'm talking about the first section, we're up here at the top. And there's a second one, a third one, and a fourth one. So in the middle of the first section, under the name Isaac, you see the middle kingdom beginning there with the 12th dynasty. And that's what you've already gotten down here from the transparency that I put up. So running across the bottom of each one of these descriptions here of what's going on in Israel is what's going on in Egypt. So there we have the beginning of the middle kingdom. Now going all the way down to the right-hand side of this top division, you see Jacob and his family enter Egypt 430 years before the Exodus, which we changed to the date 1877 there. So you can go back and look on your Egyptian periods that I gave and see how all this fits together. Then we see Joseph on down to the second division, the left-hand side of your chart. Joseph dying around 1804. Now, there are a couple of these dates that we changed on here. We added 2 years to them, but we're not going to try to run through here and change every date. So the important dates that I gave you, we changed to synchronize them with 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 in an earlier study. But the rest of these we're going to leave just like they have them here, even though they would be off, according to our calculations, by 2 years, since we've changed them a little bit. Now, what we need to see here, a very important thing, after Joseph dies, we see a period of about 70